partner states, the United Nations, other international organizations to investigate cases within our jurisdiction in Ukraine and beyond. The responsibilities that I hold and the much more powerful, much more relevant and much wider responsibilities that you hold demand no less than we meet the challenges of today. We must demonstrate the resolve and the determination and the principle in order not to disappoint and fail those that are in most need of the law as we speak. Thank you so much.
I will now make a statement in my capacity as Minister of Europe and Minister of Foreign Affairs of France. Mr. Secretary General, Prime Minister, ladies and gentlemen, ministers, Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, ladies and gentlemen. It is with a great sense of seriousness that I take the floor at this session dedicated to the situation in Ukraine and more particularly to the crimes committed. The aggression that Russia decided to launch alone against a sovereign state, Ukraine, whose only fault was to want to live freely, constitutes a flagrant violation of the fundamental norms of our common charter, the United Nations Charter. The non-use of force, peaceful resolution of disputes, respect for sovereignty, and the territorial integrity of states are principles to which we all subscribed around this table. And each one of these principles was blatantly violated. The war, which began on the 24th of February of this year, has also been accompanied by atrocities and destructions of civilian infrastructure. These are so many violations of the laws of war and so many actions for which Russia must be held accountable. In Bucha and so many other places, unspeakable crimes were committed. The liberation of Izum has also been accompanied by the discovery of new atrocities committed by the torturers. So the message of France today is simple. Justice must be our common imperative. There will be no peace without justice. Justice, of course, is an imperative for the victims, who have the right to recognition and reparation for their suffering, all their sufferings, of each victim. Justice is then an imperative of international security, and I say this to those who only see this war as simple as just another conflict. If everything is permissible here, then it'll be even more permissible somewhere else, and the possibility of a war of aggression will only grow. Justice, finally, is a political imperative. We will need to ensure that individuals are held accountable for the crimes that they've committed, whether they have committed them, ordered them, or planned them. But it's the very idea that such crimes, that such violations of our common humanity are possible should be combated both in words and in deeds. For this, a framework was established, a professional and specialized justice. At its summit is the International Criminal Court, where 43 states, including France, referred cases to it. It's the very first time that so many states have referred the situation to the court, and it's a sign of importance that we attach collectively to what is taking place here. The court will act in complementarity, as you know, with Ukrainian justice as well as with other national jurisdictions, including the French jurisdiction and several other jurisdictions of the states present here. In this framework, justice must be upheld. France is working with many other partners to strengthen in all of its jurisdictions the collection of evidence and the collection of reliable information. This is why France has acted very specifically. As soon as information about the crimes committed in Bucha were known in April, we sent 2 teams of investigators to Ukraine. For 3 months, they've helped the Ukrainian justice to minutely and patiently reconstitute the facts. And we have donated a mobile laboratory to analyze DNA. Now that in Izum new atrocities have been revealed to the world, we just decided to send another support mission to the investigators on site. because where Russia is acting by using propaganda and disinformation, justice should be based on facts and evidence. Of course, we've also supported the ICC. We've provided financial support and provided magistrates, while of course respecting its independence. Our support is also to all the jurisdictions that should be able to easily cooperate amongst themselves, including to allow the International Criminal Court to take part in common investigative teams that bring together several national jurisdictions, including the jurisdiction of Ukraine. What we are doing makes a lot of sense. We're combating impunity, but we're also defending the integrity of our international order. The choice of war by Russia on a false pretext, it's blatant violation of such a notion as genocide, which is the worst crime of all, a crime that justified after the end of the Second World War, that the project of international criminal justice progresses. This is something that really is shocking. The International Criminal Court has itself noted the abusive conduct by referring to this this notion. And in fact, the population in conquered territory is subject to terror, and some threaten using every possible means, while we here refuse to be drawn into any escalation. In the face of those who deprive words of their meaning, our mission, our duty, our work around this table in this council is to give back meaning to things. And to conclude, I want to quote a Russian writer. We must publicly condemn the very idea that men can exercise violence against other men. By being silent about vice, we are sowing vice, and in the future it will only grow 1,000 times. End of quote. By writing these lines, Solzhenitsyn referred to decades of crimes committed by the USSR in its own territory. And those words very much apply today to the crimes committed by Russia outside its territory. The facts investigated by the ICC could constitute crimes against humanity. We will investigate this, but already we must say that those responsible will be identified, they will be prosecuted, and ultimately they will be judged. For the victims, the wait may seem long, and for their families, but they must be certain, they must have the certainty that these crimes will not remain unpunished. We owe it to them. And it's not only that we owe it to them, but what's at stake is our security. And what's at stake are the universal principles that unite us. Thank you very much. And now I go back to my role as President of the Council and give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Jonas Gahr Store, Prime Minister of Norway.
Madame Présidente, je vous remercie.
Thank you, Madam President.
Mr. Karim Khan, thank you for your briefings. This week here at the United Nations, I believe we have seen how we as a global community face dire challenges from war, climate change, energy shortage, food insecurity and inequality. And we see how it is ordinary people who pay the heaviest price. Against this background, I believe it's our responsibility as members of the United Nations, and in particular we 15 around this table, to chart a different path, one of hope and belief in what we can achieve together for our citizens and for humanity. The Secretary General underlined this eloquently in his address on Tuesday, and yet again today. We have the values and principles necessary to chart that course, and they are all enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations. Madam President, the Charter sets out clear principles for a rules-based international order, and sadly this order is under attack. Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine constitutes a gross violation of international law, including the UN Charter, a violation of the core principle on which this organization is built, the sovereign equality of all its people. and members. Madam President, I listened carefully to President Putin's speech yesterday, announcing a major escalation of this war, explained by a long list of allegations that Russia is being threatened from the West. Madam President, speaking for Norway, an elected member of this Council, a European state, a NATO member, and a neighbor to Russia, let me say as clearly as I can. These allegations are simply not true. There is no military threat against Russia. There is no legitimate reason whatsoever to underpin a massive mobilization of Russian troops. This escalation will only lead to increased suffering for Ukrainians and Russians alike. Russia must abide by the order of the International Court of Justice and immediately suspend its military operations in the territory of Ukraine. Russia chose to start this war. It must now choose to stop it. None of the differences there may be between Russia and Ukraine can be solved by the ongoing military onslaught. So, Madam President, this General Assembly of the United Nations has reminded us of the global consequences of this war. Surging energy prices and increasing food insecurity are exacerbating the suffering of those who are most vulnerable. Not to mention the potential effects of a nuclear accident in Ukraine, which could have far-reaching consequences. The presence of Russian forces at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant severely compromises nuclear safety and security. We commend the IAEA for its efforts in helping to stabilize the situation. But Russia's behavior is also hurting multilateral cooperation at a time when we need it more than ever. The Black Sea Grain Initiative is an important step to bring Ukrainian foodstuff back to the world market. As the Secretary General has said, it's multilateral diplomacy in action, and we commend his efforts to facilitate this initiative. Norway also expresses its full support for the Secretary General's goods offices. When the time comes, and it must come, we will stand firmly with the UN in the efforts to build and sustain peace. Madam President, in Ukraine, thousands of civilians, including children, have been killed. Millions have fled their countries, often separated from their loved ones. Many thousands have been welcomed in my country. May the day come, sooner rather than later, when they can return home safely to rebuild their country. The recent escalation of attacks on civilian targets is utterly unacceptable. Russia's indiscriminate use of heavy explosive weapons in destroying homes, schools, and hospitals. Unspeakable horrors were revealed in Bucha in March, and now in Izium and other places previously under occupation. Civilians have forcibly been transferred to Russia and Russian-occupied territory. And there are disturbing reports of sexual violence being used as a tactic of war. This must be condemned in the strongest possible terms. Madam President, we also condemn the planned so-called referendums in the occupied regions of Ukraine. They would be contrary to international law, they would be a clear breach of the UN Charter, and they would have no legal standing and no legitimacy. They would in no way affect Ukraine's sovereignty within its international recognized borders. Let that be clear. Madam President, international law is not optional, and as the prosecutor said, justice is not political. All reports of atrocities and human rights violations must be properly investigated and those responsible brought to justice. Norway has supported this effort and will continue to do so. There can be no impunity, as Madam President so accurately said. Accountability is key, but to ensure justice for the victims and to deter future violations. Perpetrators must be held to account through national or international criminal justice mechanisms. This is why we welcome the Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine established by the Human Rights Council, and Norway continues to fully support the International Criminal Court. The ICC's mission is crucial both in the context of Ukraine and globally. Madam President, let me end on this note. This war is a catastrophe for Ukraine and its people. Its ramifications have serious consequences for vulnerable people and communities all around the world. But let me say this, it is also detrimental to Russia itself, our neighbor. Thousands of Russian soldiers have been sent to their deaths in unnecessary and illegal war. Russian citizens are increasingly being denied human rights and fundamental freedoms in a society ruled with an even stronger authoritarian fist. If the Russian people, and we know them, could freely express their views, would they have chosen war? I doubt it. So, Madam President, democracy, rule of law and human rights are essential. They are our best tools for promoting peace between states and accountability at all levels. They are also what we have to build on when we turn our back on war and destruction. We must defend these norms and standards and the values that underpin them. And again, the core principles are enshrined in the Charter. Preventing and ending acts of aggression is a direct responsibility of the Security Council, and Norway will continue to use the remaining part of its elected period here to promote dialogue and a peaceful settlement and fair resolution to this meaningless war. But we will also, Madam President, stand up for Ukraine's right to defend itself against onslaught and aggression, as we will defend our right to support Ukraine in its self-defense. We will speak up for international law, for the values of the United Nations, and take action for all people in need who are affected by this war, no matter where they are. Because this war of aggression is an attack not just against Ukraine, but also against the principles and values of the UN Charter. The Ukrainian people are giving their lives to defend these universal values and their own independence. And Ukraine can count on Norway's continued support in this struggle. Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank His Excellency, Mr. Stur, for his statement. I give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Marcelo Ebrard Casabon, Secretary of Foreign Affairs of Mexico. Thank you, Madam President. I thank the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, and the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, Karim Khan, for their valuable briefings. I welcome the presence at this meeting of the Security Council of the Prime Minister of Norway and of other colleagues, ministers, and high-level representatives. I thank France, too, and you, Madam Minister, for having convened this debate on a flagrant breach of the provisions of the Charter of the United Nations, a violation of peace and international security. 7 months after the war in Ukraine began, its multiple social, economic, and political implications are clear. As in any armed conflict, civil society has paid the highest price. This war has led to massive displacements of people, both inside Ukraine and towards neighboring countries, above all women and children. Property damage is also severe and burdensome. Since the beginning of the hostilities, Mexico has insisted on the need for a diplomatic solution and responding to the humanitarian dimension of the conflict without subordinating it to political considerations in strict adherence to international humanitarian law. In this regard, we sponsored with France a draft resolution which was turned over to the General Assembly and gave rise to Resolution E11-2 adopted last March 24. Today we reiterate that humanitarian assistance continues to be a priority which is indispensable. We have also, to the best of our ability, supported the mediation efforts of the Secretary General, and together with Norway, we drafted a presidential statement to this end, adopted last May 6. This statement is evidently not enough, but it is the only public expression that this Council has been able to make since the beginning of the conflict. The progress of the war, with its enormous human and material cost, and the increase of humanitarian needs due to the conflict, such as the dearth of humanitarian supplies and the high cost of fuel facing winter, urgently require a solution through diplomatic means and a ceasefire. For this, we need political will of the parties and commitment from the international community. It is thus necessary to stress respect for international law, including international humanitarian law, and international human rights law. Accountability is also another fundamental pillar of the multilateral system, the rule of law, and sustainable peace. For this reason, without any pretext or precondition, those responsible for crimes committed in Ukraine must be brought to justice. In this regard, the work of the International Criminal Court is essential to investigate the reports of alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity. We will follow with the greatest attention the progress of these investigations. Greatly concerning is the dimension of nuclear risk derived from confrontations around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant. Ensuring its integrity and proper operations is critical to avoid the worst of any possible catastrophe. We support the recommendations made by the IAEA after its technical inspection. These recommendations must be followed immediately. We support the calls to create a security perimeter around the plant. Lastly, we acknowledge the value of the signing of the Black Sea Grain Initiative. FAO indices have shown that grain prices in the last 2 months have begun to drop. It is a demonstration of the value of diplomacy. Even in the midst of war, dialogue and agreements are possible. It is also essential to guarantee the access of fertilizers to global markets, and we are encouraged to see that specific steps already have been taken in this direction. We acknowledge the leadership of the Secretary General of the United Nations, as well as the President of Turkey, in managing the aforementioned agreements. Madam President, since the beginning of the conflict, my country's position has been based on our constitutional principles of foreign policy, which are in accordance with the principles and purposes of the Charter of the United Nations, particularly non-intervention, pacific settlements of disputes, and the prohibition of the threat or use of force. There is no space for ambiguity. Peaceful coexistence of states depends precisely on respect for all of these. There cannot be any exception. Over these months, we have been clear in reiterating the importance of Article 2 of the Charter of the United Nations with regard to prohibiting the use of force against the territorial integrity and political independence of any state. Through our own experience, Mexico knows and well understands the importance of having the basic guarantee of being able to live without the threat of being invaded by another state. Any action violating this principle is illegal and illegitimate. The purpose of this organization and the mandate of this council is preventing the suffering of humanity from the scourge of war. But this can only be achieved through dialogue, diplomacy, and the building of effective political channels, and security of individuals and territorial integrity of countries. Indifference is unacceptable, and also unacceptable is simply deploring that until now, in this particular case, the Security Council has not been able to fulfill its responsibilities. The reasons why this council is dysfunctional are well known. Correcting them depends on us. The time is ripe to seriously raise the structural reforms which are required for this purpose. Madam President, based on its vocation for peace, Mexico believes that the international community must now channel its best efforts to attain peace. In this regard, allow me to share the proposal of the President of Mexico, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, to bolster the mediation efforts of the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, by creating a caucus for dialogue and peace in Ukraine, with the participations of other heads of state and government, including His Excellency Narendra Modi and His Holiness Pope Francis. The objective would be very clear: generating new mechanisms for dialogue and creating additional spaces for mediation which foster trust, reduce tension, and open the path towards lasting peace. Mexico's delegation will continue with the necessary consultations with the sole purpose of contributing as an impartial, good faith actor to generating broad support for the mediation efforts of the Secretary General and the aforementioned caucus, and we hope that it will be created with the support of member states of the United Nations. As the Secretary General just said, the time has come to act, to commit to peace. resigning ourselves to war is simply to stand on the edge of the abyss. Thank you very much. I thank His Excellency Mr. Evrard Cassabon, and I give the floor to Mr. Anthony Blinken, Secretary of State of the United States of America. Thank you very much, Madam, for having brought this Council together at this very grave moment of the crisis of the war of Russia on Ukraine.
Determination and the moral clarity that you've brought to ending this brutal war and defending the UN's core principles, and also for your personal engagement in securing the vital Black Sea route for grain to flow once again from Ukraine. Mr. Khan, we're grateful for the efforts of the Office of the Prosecutor to investigate objectively and professionally the atrocities being committed in Ukraine by Russian forces, and for its support for and coordination with Ukrainian investigators and prosecutors. We hear a lot about the divisions among countries at the United Nations. But recently, what is striking is the remarkable unity among member states when it comes to Russia's war on Ukraine. Leaders from countries developing and developed, big and small, north and south, have spoken in the General Assembly about the consequences of this war and the need to end it. And they've called on all of us to reaffirm our commitment to the UN Charter and its core principles, including sovereignty, territorial integrity, human rights. Even a number of nations that maintain close ties with Moscow have said publicly that they have serious questions and concerns about President Putin's ongoing invasion. Rather than change course, however, President Putin has doubled down, choosing not to end the war, but to expand it, not to pull troops back, but to call 300,000 additional troops up, not to ease tensions, but to escalate them through the threat of nuclear weapons, not to work toward a diplomatic solution, but to render such a solution impossible by seeking to annex more Ukrainian territory through sham referenda. That President Putin picked this week, as most of the world gathers at the United Nations, to add fuel to the fire that he started, shows his utter contempt for the UN Charter, for the General Assembly, and for this Council. The very international order that we have gathered here to uphold is being shredded before our eyes. We cannot, we will not allow President Putin to get away with it. Defending Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity is about much more than standing up for one nation's right to choose its own path, fundamental as that right is. It's also about protecting an international order where no nation can redraw the borders of another by force. If we fail to defend this principle when the Kremlin is so flagrantly violating it, we send a message to aggressors everywhere that they can ignore it too. We put every country at risk. We open the door to a less secure, a less peaceful world. We see what that world looks like in the parts of Ukraine controlled by Russian forces. Wherever the Russian tide recedes, we discover the horror that's left in its wake. I had a window into that horror myself when I traveled to Irpin just a few weeks ago to meet with the Ukrainian investigators who were compiling evidence of war crimes committed there. I saw up close the gaping holes left in residential buildings by Russian shelling, indiscriminate at best, intentional at worst. As we assemble here, Ukrainian and international investigators continue to exhume bodies outside of Izium, a city Russian forces controlled for 6 months before they were driven out by Ukrainian counteroffensive. One site contains some 440 unmarked graves. A number of the bodies unearthed there so far reportedly show signs of torture, including one victim with broken arms and a rope around his neck. Survivors' accounts are also emerging, including a man who described being tortured by Russian forces for 12 days, during which his interrogators repeatedly electrocuted him and, in his words, and I quote, "beat me to the point where I didn't feel anything," end quote. These are not the acts of rogue units. They fit a clear pattern across the territory controlled by Russian forces. This is one of the many reasons that we support a range of national and international efforts to collect and examine the mounting evidence of war crimes in Ukraine. We must hold the perpetrators accountable for these crimes. It's also one of the reasons why more than 40 nations have come together to help the Ukrainian people defend themselves, a right that is enshrined in Article 51 of the United Nations Charter. The more setbacks Russian forces endure on the battlefield, the greater the pain they are inflicting on Ukrainian civilians. Russian attacks on dams, on bridges, on power stations, on hospitals, on other civilian infrastructure are increasing, constituting a brazen violation of international humanitarian law. This week, President Putin said that Russia would not hesitate to use, and I quote, all weapon systems available, end quote, in response to a threat to its territorial integrity. A threat that is all the more menacing given Russia's intention to annex large swaths of Ukraine in the days ahead. When that's complete, we can expect President Putin will claim any Ukrainian effort to liberate this land as an attack on so-called Russian territory. This from a country that in January of this year, in this place, joined other permanent members of the Security Council in signing a statement affirming that, and I quote, nuclear war can never be won and must never be fought. Yet another example of how Russia violates the commitments it's made before this body, and yet another reason why nobody should take Russia at its word today. Every council member should send a clear message that these reckless nuclear threats must stop immediately. Russia's effort to annex more Ukrainian territory is another dangerous escalation, as well as a repudiation of diplomacy. It is even more alarming when coupled with the filtration operation that Russian forces have been carrying out across parts of Ukraine that they control. Now, this is a diabolical strategy, violently uprooting thousands of Ukrainians, bus in Russians to replace them, call a vote, manipulate the results to show near unanimous support for joining the Russian Federation. This is right out of the Crimea playbook. As with Crimea, it's imperative that every member of this council, and for that matter, every member of the United Nations, reject these sham referenda and unequivocally declare that all Ukrainian territory is and will remain part of Ukraine. And no Russian claim to annex territory can take away Ukraine's right to defend its own land. Putin's invasion is also distracting this council, in fact, the entire UN system, from working on the serious issues that we all want to focus on, like preventing a climate catastrophe, aiding tens of millions of people on the brink of famine, fulfilling the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, shoring up our interconnected health security, all issues that make a tangible difference in the lives of the citizens that we are here to represent, and that they are looking to us to deliver on. The overwhelming majority of UN member states are committed to working together on these issues, and our actions show that. Yet, while more than 100 countries have signed on to a roadmap to provide food aid to those who need it, and partners across Africa, Asia, the Americas, and Europe are working together to increase the resilience of global food systems, Russia for months blocked the export of Ukrainian grain to the world until the United Nations and Turkey secured a deal to let the grain go. And Russia continues to bomb and seize Ukrainian farms and silos, line its wheat fields with landmines, raising the cost of food for people everywhere. And while governments around the world are teaming up with international organizations, with the private sector, with philanthropies, to end this pandemic and make sure that we're better prepared for the next one, Russia is spreading misinformation and disinformation about WHO-approved vaccines, fueling vaccine hesitancy that puts people in all our countries at greater risk. Here's the reality. None of us chose this war. Not the Ukrainians, who knew the crushing toll it would take. Not the United States, which warned that it was coming and worked to prevent it. not the vast majority of countries at the United Nations. And neither did our people, or the people of virtually every UN member state, who are feeling the war's consequences in greater food insecurity and higher energy prices. Nor did the Russian mothers and fathers, whose children are being sent off to fight and die in this war, or the Russian citizens, who continue to risk their freedom to protest against it, including those who came out into the streets of Moscow after President Putin announced his mobilization to chant, "Let our children live." Indeed, it must be asked, how has this aggression against Ukraine by President Putin improved the lives or prospects of a single Russian citizen? One man chose this war. One man can end it. Because if Russia stops fighting, the war ends. If Ukraine stops fighting, Ukraine ends. That's why we will continue to support Ukraine as it defends itself and strengthen its hand to achieve a diplomatic solution on just terms at a negotiating table. As President Zelensky has said repeatedly, diplomacy is the only way to end this war. But diplomacy cannot and must not be used as a cudgel to impose on Ukraine a settlement that cuts against the UN Charter or rewards Russia for violating it. President Putin is making his choice. Now, it's up to all of our countries to make ours. Tell President Putin to stop the horror that he started. Tell him to stop putting his interests above the interests of the rest of the world, including his own people. Tell him to stop debasing this council and everything it stands for. We, the people of the United Nations, determined. That is how the preamble of the UN Charter starts. Let's not forget that we, the peoples, still get to choose the fate of this institution and our world. The stakes are clear. The choice is ours. Let's make the right choice for the world that we want and that our people so desperately deserve. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency, Mr. Blinken, for his statement. I give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Wang Yi, State Councillor and Minister of Foreign Affairs of China.
Madam President, Mr. Secretary General, I thank Foreign Minister Colonna for convening today's ministerial meeting, and I thank Secretary General Guterres for his briefing. China's position on Ukraine is consistent and clear. President Xi Jinping pointed out that the sovereignty, territorial integrity of all countries should be respected. The purposes and the principles of the UN Charter should be observed. The reasonable security concerns of all countries should be taken seriously, and all efforts that could help resolve the crisis should be supported. China follows Ukraine's humanitarian situation very closely and has assisted Ukraine with 35 million yuan of humanitarian supplies. This year, we have provided other developing countries with 15,000 tons of emergency humanitarian food assistance and contributed positively to easing the global food crisis. In response to the current situation, China would like to make the following 4 proposals. First, we must stick to dialogue and negotiations. The top priority is for the parties to resume dialogue without precondition, commit to dialogue without presuming the outcome, include reasonable concerns into negotiations, and put feasible options on the table so that the talks can produce results and bring about peace. Second, we must work together for de-escalation. The parties concerned should exercise restraint and avoid escalating tensions. The international community should play a constructive role to help de-escalate and create conditions and space for political settlement. When it comes to the safety and security of nuclear facilities, there is no room for trial and error. Accidents and risks must be prevented. We support the IAEA in upholding a fair and objective position and playing a positive role. Third, we must earnestly ease the humanitarian situation. It is vital to observe the international humanitarian law, prevent any attacks against civilians, civilian facilities, and minimize civilian casualties. Investigations into violations of the international humanitarian law should be objective and fair, based on fair facts rather than an assumption of guilt and without being politicized. The international community needs to support the UN humanitarian agencies in upholding neutrality and equity and continue to provide assistance to those affected in Ukraine and its neighboring countries. Fourth, we must contain spillovers. Energy suppliers and consumers should work together to keep the global energy market stable. We support the Secretary General in helping facilitate the exports of Russian and Ukrainian grains. China, on its part, has put forth the International Food Security Cooperation Initiative, and we welcome positive response from all countries. No country should resort to arbitrary unilateral sanctions, still less let developing countries pay the price. Madam President, the Security Council, as the core of the collective security mechanism, should uphold the basic principles of objectivity and impartiality on the issue of Ukraine, keep to the right direction of ceasefire and peace talks, and prioritize mediation tools in the pursuit of settlement. We need to pour positive energy for peace and reconciliation and take constructive and responsible actions towards political settlement. The Ukraine crisis is closely linked to the international situation. The more challenging the situation is, the more important it is to stay united and seek cooperation. We must work in coordination to uphold the UN-centered international system, abide by the basic norms of international relations based on the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, accommodate the legitimate concerns of all parties, abandon hegemonism and power politics, and prevent any form of hot war or the so-called new Cold War. Let us commit to common, comprehensive, cooperative, and sustainable security, seek common ground despite differences, accommodate and understand each other, and work tirelessly for restoring security in Europe and peace in the world. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency, Mr. Wang, for his statement, and I give the floor to Her Excellency, Ms. Olta Jashka, Minister for Europe and Foreign Affairs of Albania.
Madam President, I join other colleagues to thank France for convening today's briefing and Minister Colonna for chairing it. This issue has been without interruption on the agenda of the Council, but this meeting could not be timelier given the latest escalatory declarations by Kremlin. I also welcome the decision of the French presidency of the Council to continue keeping the focus on accountability, an issue of the utmost importance that we initiated together back in April with the ARIA Formula meeting that Albania and France organized jointly. I also thank ICC Prosecutor General Khan for his information and his tireless efforts to establish accountability in Ukraine. Madam President, the Russian Federation, a permanent member of the Security Council, has waged an illegal war of aggression against Ukraine. In our judgment and in the eyes of the entire world, as clearly expressed more than once here in the United Nations, Russia's actions are a blatant violation of the Charter of the United Nations. Let's not forget that the highest international justice body, the International Court of Justice, has ordered Russia to suspend its military operation in Ukraine. International law is the same and mandatory for all. Russia has unfortunately chosen to openly